here, so to speak. That said, just killer novel, dude. This novel being The Luminous Dead by Caitlin Starling. It was a really, really good read, but as I got to the end, I actually came to find out this was her first novel. I thought that was really badass, and I didn't know that going into it. I thought it was really cool to find out at the end of the book. I thought that was fun. Um, in case you guys don't know, here as of late, I've been reading books from uh, horror lists like online. Like I've been googling like scariest books, da 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 da, and jumping around and looking at different you know lists like that. And when I see books on multiple lists, I kind of check those ones out. That's kind of how I've been filtering. So this one I've actually seen on several of those lists in the last year or two. This book was actually it just came out a couple of years ago, even. Looks like our library got it in May of 2019, but I'm not entirely sure. Like I said, I'm not that person. That said, let's jump into it without a prologue. I feel like the first chapter is the way to go. Otherwise, you have no idea what the fucking stuff was happening. So let's do this. Chapter 1. She'd never gone this deep. Guile rigged her armored body another centimeter into the crevice, then eased her bag of gear after her. The plating on the back of her calf scraped against the stone. She winced at the noise. Nobody had warned her, Jesus, that the opening to the lower cave system was so small, or so empty. To be fair, she hadn't got a lot of warning or preparation. She'd been too eager to get below the surface to question it. There should have been more than the limited orientation she'd received. Still, when she'd signed up for the expedition, she had assumed three things. I need a little bit more light. One, that there would be a team assisting her, monitoring the readings from her suit from afar, pulling up maps for her when possible, and keeping her company in the dwindling light as she left the surface. Two, that she would enter through a giant borehole into a mining camp. God, this crank this light up, y'all. Not the right way, light. Go up. There we go. Okay. A mining camp, and would stage in that camp before pressing deeper into the ground. And three, that the amount of money she was being offered would be directly related to the sophistication of the expedition. Yet here she was, alone in a tiny crevice, in an unknown site, her helmet speakers silent. Caver here, she said for the fifth time. Would appreciate contact, base. For the fifth time, there was no response. The only sounds were her breathing inside her helmet, the soft pulsing of the alert system displayed in front of her face, and the groan of her suit against rock as she contorted her spine and pressed through another few centimeters. Geyer paused, leaning against the curved crevice wall. Maybe she should go back. Maybe her suit was malfunctioning. At the hospital, where she had been fitted into it, she had gone through the regular check and double check of all systems, including communications transmissions. Everything had been fine then, and her year of helping other cavers into similar suits told her that all systems were go. But she didn't have a death wish. Going any farther without comms was suicide. Her eyes flicked over the readouts inside her suit again. Everything was normal. Beginning to suspect suit is shot, she said anyway, addressing the emptiness, preparing to abort. The speakers on her helmet finally came to life. Negative. Do not abort, Caver. Continue. The voice sounded female, clipped and authoritative. More important, it sounded real, not a computerized response. Well, that got a reaction. Geyer's lips twisted into a bitter approximation of a smile. Roger, she muttered and shuffled another few centimeters. Excuse me. The crevice widened abruptly about half a meter farther in. Geyer stumbled in, reflexively moving to dust herself off, but carbon polymer just scraped over carbon polymer. A frustrating reminder that for the next several weeks, or even months, she wouldn't be able to feel her own skin. She shook her head. Rookie. The suit was her new skin, filled with sensors and support functions, dampening her heat and strengthening her already powerful muscles with an articulated exoskeleton designed to keep climbing as natural as possible. She wouldn't even remove her helmet to eat or sleep. Her large intestine had been rerouted to collect waste for easy removal, and a feeding tube had been implanted through her abdominal wall 10 days ago. A port on the outside of her suit would connect to nutrition canisters. All liquid waste would be recycled by the suit. All solid waste would be compacted and cooled to ambient temperature, then either carried with her or stored in caches to retrieved on her trip out. Everything was painstakingly, extensively designed to protect her from elements in the cave. And all the while, her handlers would be monitoring her vitals and surveying her surroundings for her. If Geyer's job was to move and climb and explore, it was her handler's job to document. Favor, continue, repeated the woman from before. Geyer scowled, then straightened up and looked around the cavern. Her suit used a combination of infrared and sonar pulses to generate readings on the surrounding topography, which was reconstructed into what looked like a well-lit but colorless scene on the screen in front of her. In an emergency, the reconstruction could be turned off and a normal light turned on, but it wasn't advisable to have a lamp burning, giving off heat, attracting attention down in the cold darkness of the caves. There was a reason, after all, that cavers could demand enough money that they'd be able to get off-world after only 2, maybe 3 jobs. I said that backwards. I said 2 jobs, maybe 3. But still, here we are. Too many cavers didn't make it that long. Just one of the many reasons Geyer was going to do it in one. Continuing, she acknowledged. Paused first to drink in the space. The ceiling was high and vaulted, round, even, and dry. Far off, she thought she could hear water. The surface had been in a near constant drought since she was a child. Most of the deep caves in this area still had flowing water through them, and would periodically flood from harsh, sudden storms that destroyed settlements and washed away topsoil and structures on the surface. This was the first time she'd personally set foot in a chamber this deep. I just realized how fucking yellow. I hate the yellow. It was beautiful. It was also unnerving. She made her way to the marker blinking in her HUD. Clambering down a wide natural staircase, a duffel full of equipment and food slung over her shoulder. "Where's the mine, Vase?" she asked, as she slid over one of the drops and landed in a haze of dust. "Is this new ground, or just a new entrance?" Vase was, of course, silent. Maybe this was normal. She'd never heard of a taciturn support teams from the senior cavers she talked to, but she also hadn't been allowed in the topside command rooms. The problem was that if this was normal, the team would expect her to know that. They didn't know that this was her first time down. Geyer came to the edge of another, larger drop. Like the 5 she descended to get down to this initial crevice, this one had an anchor at the top, and a fresh, high-quality rope leading down. There had been other cavers here, and recently. "Base. Requesting a topside search," she said, considering the rope. "Confirm that there are no other cavers ahead of me. I'm seeing signs of 'there is no mine' and no other cavers," the woman said. "Equipment was put in and caches established in anticipation of your descent." Okay. No mine wasn't ideal, but not unheard of. Her boss must be looking for deposits in new ground, sending people in one after the other. It wasn't common these days. It wasn't common these days, with most of the land already picked over. But in a true expedition like that, pre-stocked caches were a good idea. Given the pay rate on this mission and the sophistication of her equipment, this was clearly a high-end pursuit, and yet, so far, she can only be sure of one person in the support room. And the techs who had helped calibrate her suit hadn't been chatty or worn the logo of any of the major mining concerns. She'd known from the beginning that this was an individual-run expedition, and at the time, money and the quality of the equipment had eclipsed all other considerations. They'd been worth falsifying her credentials here and there to make her look proven. They'd been worth hiring a surgeon to redirect her bowels for a month, something she really couldn't afford. But the payout from the job would more than cover it. Just so that she'd have the appropriate scars when the expedition doctors cut her open. But now, she was underground. She was beginning to wonder if she'd made a giant mistake. Of course, there could still be 5 or 10 techs. Maybe they were all shy. Maybe the woman on the mic was territorial and a total idiot. It was possible. If that was the case, she just had to keep going until shift change. In the meantime, she reassured herself that expeditions were always top heavy. They could afford to be, had to be. They were standing on a veritable mint deep below the surface of Cassandra V. The only thing keeping the colony halfway viable, and decades of mining had taught them a few things. Like the fact that early teams that went down to establish mines or take samples ended up dead. 90% failure rate. Big groups, small groups, solo experts, it didn't matter. Something always killed them. Something always killed them. Until somebody got smart enough or desperate enough to try wearing a dry suit down, alone, into a cave. Even now, nobody was sure if it was because it blocked heat rising from the body, or smell, or something else. But one person in a closed suit could survive. One person, though, needed help keeping watch while they slept, and the suits became more and more elaborate to provide for longer and longer survey missions. Now missions had at least 5 or 10 techs topside. She'd seen it firsthand. Working support on 2 medium-sized operations a year ago, she'd helped her first caver into a similar suit. A hotshot guy with 2 expeditions already under his belt, and it hadn't been nearly as elaborate and high-tech as this one. This one was top of the line, and must have demanded an even larger crew. So where were they? The sensible thing would be to call off the mission and walk back, while she still could. But she'd sacrificed too much to get here. This deep, with this much money on the line, she didn't want to go through it again. Next time, her embellished work history might not stand up to scrutiny. And if she was wrong, if there was a team and she walked out, nobody wanted to hire, did you hear that? Nobody wanted to hire a caver who would breach contract. Not when there were so many others waiting to be picked. Not when there were 100 other kids as desperate as I am. Gaia rolled her shoulders back to center herself, then clipped into the rope at hip level, attaching the devil to her suit. It was the first of several she'd be ferrying in that day. The rest stacked and waited for her on the other side of the narrow crevice she'd entered through. She reached behind her to the hump of hard carbon seated across her shoulders. All her equipment was slotted into the suit itself, and the storage space on her back protruded almost like a satchel. As she ghosted her fingers over the release sensors, that's the word, release. All fucking tongue-tied there. As she ghosted her fingers over the release sensors, her HUD displayed what was stored there. Her rappel rack was within easy reach, and she released it from its slot, then hitched it in front of her suit and threaded the rope through its bars. Once it was secure, she glanced over the edge again. Readout display blinked as it measured the distance down the few sonar pulses. 70 meters. In normal light, the bottom would have been pitch black, but the HUD's reconstruction showed it in full detail as if there were only a few meters away. She crouched to check the anchor, even though she had already practiced this hundreds of times since signing on to this project. Nothing about cave exploration should be done on autopilot. Damn, tongue-tied again. Ugh. Everything looked fine. She'd been trained, or rather, she'd taught herself to place her own anchors every time. But the other, shorter drops she'd already done had been anchored correctly. Base had confirmed this one had been placed for her. Caver, continue, the handler said, her voice flat and motionless. Geyer straightened, checked her device one last time, then stepped off the edge. So that is the end of chapter 1. What do you guys think? Do we proceed on chapter 2, or am I going to jump forward like 200 fucking pages to like a more intense little moment that's happening? Which was going to half-ass my plan initially, by the way. Not, it would half-ass give some stuff away, but, I don't know. What do you guys think? Dun dun dun. I know there's a bit of a time gap between the talking and the potential. See how long chapter 2 is. Some of these chapters are quite short in this book. It's like chapter 2. Did you hear that? Chapter 2 isn't much. Let's jump randomly with this thing. Not necessarily random. Jump forward those 200 pages. Okay, so bear in mind, this is not the same descent. Her video feed blinked on. Geyer stared at it, too tired to turn it off. It looked pristine. She'd changed her clothing at some point, and her hair was pulled back neatly. You've gone past rested. Past stressed, excuse me. You sound terrified. I'm trying to ignore that, Geyer said, scowling. Em couldn't know. Wait a minute. Must have fucked up the page where I was trying to go. Had a little place, I thought, where I was going to jump to and have a specific thing. Here we go. It doesn't matter. We're going to randomly start chapter 17. Fuck it. She walked for 5 more hours, the incline staying shallow enough that there were only 2 occasions where she put bolts in to scale the sudden pitches. Too smooth to climb without a rope. Still, by the end of the day, she was exhausted and weak, brain fried by the constant evenness of her environment. It was as if she could feel the thrum of a tunneler on some back channel of her brain. An echo off the stone had bored through it and passed. Without input, her brain seemed bent on creating its own stimulation. There were no more skittering insects. But she had songs stuck in her head that sounded like they came from far away. The movements of her hand at the edge of her display became a distant figure. More than once. It wasn't constant, but it was relentless. And then the feeling of being watched came back. It had been a prickle, a crawling in the back of her mind. Just after, oh shit. Sounds like we just gotta follow. Prince, oh my god, it disappeared. Princess Yam! That's awesome. Let me hit you with that shout out action real quick. There will be, you'll get automatically retweeted all over, the Twitterverse with hashtags and stuff like that. Thank you for the fucking follow. That's awesome. That's badass. Thank you. Hell yeah. And then the feeling of being watched came back. It had been a prickle, a crawling in the back of her mind. Just after the bugs had passed her, making their way down to the sump. Now was a bone-deep dread, a sickness in her stomach. It strengthened in waves, and the more she fought it, the stronger it grew. She felt it like a presence, like a tug at her center, like she was forgetting something she shouldn't be. She just turned around, she would see them. I can't say this name because the names are weird in this, but it's Isolde. That's my bad. A couple of them are weird. Or some other stranger. Perhaps Hanmei, waterlogged, or Jenny, legs broken into impossible angles, waiting for her. It didn't matter that there were no hiding places in this passage. That it was impossible for anybody to have followed her. Down here, she could imagine them emerging from the blankness of the walls, as phantom thin as the insects. She clamped down with as much willpower as she could muster, refusing to let herself look over her shoulder or signal to him in any way that she was losing her grip on reality. That's awesome. Thank you again. Losing her grip on reality. Maybe somewhere in her suit. Maybe something, in her suit was breaking down. Maybe Em had been wrong about Camp 5 spores, and they'd gotten through her suit's filtration. Just because they hadn't been in her bloodstream by the time Emma had checked didn't mean they hadn't done irreparable damage. She could see it now. Scans of her brain marked by great black holes where spores had eaten away at her. Or maybe the chemicals in that final horrible sump had started some slow rotting of the suit itself. She tried to remember if Em had gone into detail about the tests she'd run. Had she tested Geyer's blood? She couldn't remember the feeling of being taken. Hell yeah. Appreciate that host spot. The fucking title covered it and I can't see who it is. And I'm on the wrong screen for that, but I fucking appreciate you, man. Thanks for the love, everybody. I don't know why I couldn't see over that one for whatever reason. Son of a bitch. Had she tested Geyer's blood? She couldn't remember the feeling of blood being taken. Would she have even noticed? Em had said it was clear. That was fine, but can I trust what she said? Can I trust that she even said it? Geyer pictured the commands that would take her to the medical readouts in her suit. She could look at the log, look at how much of each drug was left, look at test results if Em had run them, if she hadn't scrubbed them. But she was too afraid to look. If Em had run the test, if it hadn't been the spores, then Geyer had seen Isolde, and they meant that Geyer could be sensing something real, something impossible, falling just behind her. She made camp after 7 hours of mindless walking. Em had tried starting conversations several times over the course of the day, but Geyer had only grunted in reply, too nervous that her unease and growing panic would seep into anything she said, too afraid that what she was hearing wasn't Em at all. It had made the climb feel like an eternity. It looks like there's a change up ahead, Em said as Geyer sat back, her head against the rock, staring at nothing and wondering if she wanted to use up one of her remaining meals. Real, not real. She didn't lose anything for looking, she decided. Heart thudding in her chest, Geyer turned her head toward whatever it was Emma was seeing. Her reconstruction showed only the curved walls of the tunnel. She hesitated a moment, then took a leap, desperate for a distraction. Don't see it, she said. It's not clear enough for my computer to shunt it to you, Em said. Lots of uncertainty. Can you get closer? A new terror bubbled up into her throat, threatening to choke her as she staggered to her feet and took 2 lurching steps up the passage. Not clear enough for the computer to shunt it to you. How often did that happen? She thought about Em deliberately hiding things from her, but not about the computer algorithms making sure she never saw confusing things. If the computer knew another person couldn't be down here, would it hide its movements, signs? Computers didn't work like that, she reminded herself. Not clear enough meant it was far away, or at a weird angle. There wasn't anything lurking just at the limits of her sonar. There couldn't be. There's a branch off, Em said, interrupting her thoughts. It could lead back to the main system, or nowhere. Geyer straddled a deep crack in the rock, then stopped, staring down. It was the first change in the tunnel all day. Hell yeah. Dude, I don't like how I can't stream machine. Hell yeah. Thanks for the fucking host spot, stream machine. What's up, guys? Appreciate that host spot. Hell yeah. What's happening, everybody? It was the first change in the tunnel all day. The reconstruction expanded, mapping out all the gaps and dips and uneven patches of stone until finally, she reached a jagged gap in the rock. It was a drop through the bottom left of the tunnel, out into a large cavern. Much of the floor below appeared to be covered in water, but across the cavern there looked like there were a few accessible banks, large, divot-topped, tiered pillars stretched toward the ceiling from the water. Geyer braced her hands on either side of the opening, staring. She knew these pillars. She knew that water. Called her. She nearly fell to her knees. It's not the lake by Camp 6, Em said. Her heart fell and frustrated tears welled up in her eyes with fierce pressure. She fought it down. Wrong. This is all wrong. But I might know where you are now, Em continued cautiously. I'll need you to go down there for a better look, though. If it's where I think you are, I can get you back to the surface, and there should be older caches nearby. The surface. She could barely think, picturing the sun, the cracked soil, her tiny cot. The surface. If she climbed down here, if she made her way back into the cave entrance, it would be all over. It would all be over, excuse me, I said that backwards. Screw Jenny and the others. Screw trying to fix this. Screw whoever came down here. They had never been her responsibility. She was the only responsibility she's ever had. Geyer backed away from the crack in the stone. Should I eat then? She rasped. Her voice sounded strained, barely human. She cleared her throat. Before I rappel down there? I'm going to lean back a little bit. I realize I'm like super leaning off the camera. I'm also going to sip the coffee. Which is Rather cold at this junction, but nonetheless. Thanks for stopping in, guys. I appreciate it, man. You know. Where were we? She cleared her throat. You know what? I'm gonna go back. Should I eat then? She rasped. Her voice sounded strained, barely human. She cleared her throat. Before I rappel down there? She didn't like the thought of using one of her few remaining rations. Not so soon after having 2 others. But the less she ate, the weaker she'd get. She couldn't be weak. And M's answer should give her a good idea of how safe Emma thought she really was. Hold off, and Em was worried. Go ahead, and everything was fine. Geyer settled down heavily. Oh, I'm sorry. I think so. I skipped like the fucking answer sentence. That's hilarious. I think so, Em said. Everything will be fine. Geyer settled down heavily, gut uncramping at M's permission. When she reached for her ration, she realized her hand was shaking. She could feel herself swaying on a thin tightrope, clinging to the assumption that she wouldn't die, while understanding that she almost certainly would. Too much confidence, and that balance would fall apart. Too much cynicism, she'd give up. But that cynicism felt good, so right, so inevitable. She was fucked. She wanted to languish in it. Her eyes went back to the crack, or she thought, or we keep pushing, and I fall apart later. That was what the Geyer from before the sump would have done, what she should have done. She seated the canister into the point on her side, then let her head drop forward in her hands. The sludge pushed through the canola, I don't know how you say that word, and into her gut. And as it flowed, she became aware of every centimeter of her skin covered by the barely there whisper of sticky, body-warm gel. The electrodes coming from her flesh, her scalp, the unrelenting structure of the suit polymers and machines, the distance between her cheeks and her palms. She fought the urge to take her helmet off or rip the canister from her side. Each feeding was getting harder to bear, half because of fear and hunger, half because of this growing physical irritation. She couldn't tell if it was only in her head or if something was beginning to go wrong. Her skin itched, her joints hurt. She wanted to be done. Geyer. Don't talk, or Gyre. I'm still not sure how to say that name. I've read that name in a bunch of different books. Gyre. Anyone? Gyre. Not that you can fucking respond other than text, leaving me in the same dilemma, but nonetheless. Anyhow. Sorry. God damn it. Gyre. Don't want to talk, she muttered. Her video feed blinked on, and Gyre stared at it, too tired to turn it off. Em looked pristine. She'd changed her clothing at some point, and her hair was pulled back neatly at the nape of her neck. You've gone past stressed. You sound terrified. I'm trying to ignore that, Geyer said, scowling. Em couldn't know. If Em knew, she'd give up on her. Write her off as good as dead, another failure. I've seen this before. Once the shock starts to fade, once you start to feel trapped, I am trapped. Nothing. I don't need to be psychoanalyzed, Geyer muttered. I need to be out of this stupid suit. I need to see the fucking sun. Em rested her chin on her fist, gazing at the screen that Geyer assumed had her face on it. Maybe it didn't. Maybe it was just a bland readout of her hormone levels. Cortisol high, adrenaline high. Was there even a camera inside her helmet? Or was she just a static headshot, a dossier? I need you to concentrate on only the next step in front of you, Em said. I'll manage your resources. I'll keep you going. I'm going to get you out of there myself if I have to. Em, climbing down into this hellhole, the thought was perversively pleasing. If down there is where you think it is, Geyer said, how bad is the climb out? Em was right. She focused on the next step, one step at a time. They'd be manageable. Tasks she knew she could do. One foot in front of the other. She rubbed at the surface of her helmet, wishing she could massage her temples through the polymer. Em hesitated, then conceded. Bad. Part of it is through an active waterfall. There's also only one cache you're going to be able to reach easily. It's half empty. It's been sitting there a long time. Not everything will be usable, but it's still rations and a few batteries for line. Geyer grimaced. Will it even still be there? Unless there's been more tunneler activity that I don't know about. It should be. Or unless it was stolen like the other one. This route? It rejoins the route I took. Yes, near Camp 4. No resources she could count on. Then, if this cache that was on the way was as depleted as it was saying, she groaned, sat back, stretched out her spine. But at least it would cut off this ascent to the long drop. Could be worse. And then, the dive at Camp 3. Yes. And it's worth it. Instead of just going forward. I still don't know if this tunnel leads to the ledge. And if you refuse to sleep here, things could deteriorate. Geyer winced. Deteriorate? Em could tell. Could see what was happening to her. If Geyer could just trust her, rely on her, lean a little bit into it, what? Em wasn't here to put a hand on her shoulder, to hold her tight. She was just a voice in her helmet, a current of drugs in her arm. Was Em beginning to feed her anxiety meds again, to counteract her irrationality? If she focused, would she feel the fog creeping in at the edge of her thoughts, just enough to make her reliable again? Geyer hesitated, then toggled the medical interface. Nothing was active. There was the counter for the anxiolytics, I can't say that word, anti-anxiety meds, and a log showed 1 dose used, dated to the sump. Adrenaline, 1 dose. Sedatives, 3. Geyer stared. 3 doses? 1 on its own, then 2 in succession. She checked the log on the double dose. It had been spread out over more than 16 hours. And there were other logs too, blood samples taken, tests run, all in the same time frame. At Camp 6. She'd felt like she'd slept for days because she had. Her stomach lurched, spasming against the feeding tube. Em hadn't said she was sedating her. Em hadn't said she'd been out for over a day, unprotected and vulnerable. Em had told her everything had been fine. But everything hadn't been fine. Em had broken her promise. Again. Geyer should have never trusted her. Should she trust her now? Geyer, Em murmured. Feeding's done. Right, Em said, shivering. Geyer said, shivering, excuse me. Better get climbing. Geyer tried to sound cheerful as she unhooked the canister. But even she could tell it sounded brittle and wrong. She stared down at her hands, at the metal tube that held a terrifyingly high portion of all her food left. Of all the food she had left. Had she taken this one from Camp 5's cache? Had the seal protected it from the spores? You can rest before the descent, Em said. Her voice so soft, so gentle. Geyer jerked forward, a whole body response to the idea. Then covered the involuntary twitch by rolling up on her knees. I don't know why I got so stuttery right there. Putting away the spent ration. Absolutely not, she said. I'm not sleeping here. I'm not letting you sedate me again. Her legs quivered as she stood up, but her hands didn't shake as she began putting in bolts. The stone was already fractured, so she put in multiple anchors, silently thanking herself for insisting on taking them with her. If she hadn't swapped the climbing anchors in her suit, what would she have done? The silt screws couldn't take her weight. More proof that all she needed to do was trust her instincts. They'd brought her this far. Everything seemed stable, but she didn't want to risk a fall from this height, even, perhaps especially, into water. She had no idea what currents were lurking beneath that lake. Though she could certainly hope for none, since Em had said this didn't lead back to the sump. If Em was right, if the computers were right. Once the anchors were in and her ropes were set up, she checked her attachments to the line. One hand twitched, threatening to descend into full-blown tremors. But as she stared at it, it firmed up. If she was lucky, it would just be an adrenaline-pumping free air descent, enough to ground her in her body again, then a brief swim, and hopefully an easy walk up to dry land. Then she would try to sleep. She hoped she hadn't used all her luck surviving in the sump. She hoped she'd been hallucinating at Camp 5. She hoped Em had gotten the spores out of her system. because beyond everything else, she hoped she really wasn't being followed. Dun dun dun. A few quick tugs or a blade and the ropes. She hoped, she hoped, she hoped. No. Geyer steadied herself, forcing away the thoughts, then began walking backward down the edge of the hole. From there, she swung out into the open air, fingers gripping vice-like around the bars of her rappel device. Her equipment held. She sighed in relief and heard an echoing exhale on M's line. "Nervous?" Geyer asked, chasing a glance at the screen. Her old... I don't know why I thought a message popped up. Her old bravado rearing up reflexively and snugging tight around her like a crusted bandage. "Watch your hands," M said. Geyer's smirk faded. She concentrated on working her rappel device, easing her fingers apart by degrees, making sure the rope was feeding through smoothly. She could see the approach of the water from the corner of her eye. The surface rendered in a placid, unmoving dark blue to set it apart from the surrounding stone. The wrongness resting in her gut eased. This was familiar. This was good. Hanging from the rope, she could think straight again. Pull of gravity, tucking her down, felt strong and right. Get to the ground. Climb back out. She'd done this before. She toggled through the display options reflexively, learning the cavern, memorizing the layout. The last known depth of the pool was only a meter where she was headed, so there shouldn't be any swimming needed. Good. Her legs burned too much to be useful in the water. The composition of the rock here was similar to Camp 4, and her headlamp showed a blue luminescence below the surface of the water. Familiar and comforting. Her headlamp also followed a figure standing on the water. The figure sank beneath the surface. "M?" she whispered. There were no ripples, no sign that anything had been there. But she'd seen it. The darkened outline of shoulders, of a head, disappearing into the surrounding gloom. Her heart stuttered in her chest, and she closed one hand around the rope in reflexive fear. There, again! It was just a flash, a shadow in the glow. It looked like a body floating just below the surface of the water, moving. Impossible. No, 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 no! M! It's funny, I just yelled, no, 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 M, and my daughter Emma just came out of her bedroom. I bet she's gonna walk up. I bet. I'm totally live right now. M is a name in the book, by the way. Sorry. That was great. She shouted, fumbling and turning the reconstruction back on. The cavern was bathed in analytical gray light, every feature marked out, every object unmoving. The surface of the water was once again rendered in flat blue, impenetrable. She tried the other settings. Nothing. What is it? There was nothing out of the ordinary. Everything around her was static, erased. Had the computer removed the confusing input, or was whoever it was too far below the surface for the sonar to find? Or was it another figment? Was she contaminated, her mind already twisted into knots? Did she see that? She asked, turning her head from side to side, searching. Did I see what? The reconstruction feed. It records, right? Even if it's not displayed, can you... Oh my god, you're too gnarly. Thank you for the coffee, darling. Glorious coffee! Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you, babe. Can you? Yes. But it will take a minute to pull up. Geyer, what's going on? The voice had gone from tired and distracted to alert, sharp. I saw somebody, Geyer whispered. M said nothing. M. There's somebody down here. I saw them. In the water. Out in the deeper part of the lake. It was a person. It was definitely a person. Her panic was growing, taking physical form in her chest, sitting on her and pressing down with all its weight. She wrapped both arms around the rope, hugging tight to it, eyes fixed on the ground below. You turned off the reconstruction. I know, my headlamp. M shook her head. The motion drew Geyer's attention through the panic. Breathe, Geyer. Your lamp doesn't reach that far. It's probably just the nerves and exhaustion combined with the darkness. I saw it against the glow. There's somebody there. The human brain projects stimuli where there are none. when it's overworked or deprived. What, like your humming? Geyer snapped. Exactly. Like the humming. It's a known phenomenon. Under stress, people hear things, or sometimes see darting shadows. Sensory deprivation chambers induce very realistic hallucinations of flashing lights and presences. It usually happens in places that would be distressing, like this. There could even be infrasonic, Jesus, I cannot spit that out, maybe from the tunneler, making you uneasy. It's fixable. Fixable? Unless all her food was contaminated. How could she have missed that until now? My feeding, it's from Camp 5. It's fine, Im said. You're fine. Was I fine when you had me sedated at Camp 6? Geyer asked, her first cracking. Im didn't respond. I saw the logs, Geyer hissed, hoping she was ashamed, hoping it hurt. It was a safety precaution, Im said. Voice strangled at first, but then she spoke again. She'd regained her footing, her tone firm, arrogant. She leaned in towards the camera. I've run every diagnostic I can. I checked all your food. You are fine. You are fine, just under too much pressure. Geyer's lips curled. If it wasn't the spores, then it was her. Crazy, Im was saying. Unreliable. Im, I already checked, Im said firmly. Your sonar didn't pick up any trace of a living thing down there. There are no other concerns with people mapping this cave system, or anywhere within at least 60 kilometers. You're alone. In the cache Camp 4, I didn't hallucinate that. No, you didn't, Im admitted. But whoever or whatever moved it couldn't have used those supplies without one of my suits. They couldn't have made it this far. It's impossible. You're alone, Geyer. You're seeing things. I gotta sip this coffee, y'all. I smell it. It smells delightful. Oh my god. Coffee. You're alone, Geyer. You're seeing things. And why should I believe that? From you. Geyer growled, one hand releasing from the rope, fingers scrambling over the outside of her helmet, as if she could shut out Im's voice by covering her ears, or take the whole fucking thing off. Her skin crawled beneath the feedback film. There's somebody else down here that there's not. You'd hide them in the name of caver management. Excuse me, sorry about that. Drank that coffee too quick. You keep me blind to them until the second they came up behind me. If you thought it'd save your precious, insane mission. Geyer, you're spiraling. I'll give you another injection of anxiolytics. It'll help. The fuck you will, Geyer snarled. She sucked in air, desperate to quell her shaking, then puffed out her breath to cycle through the options displayed inside her helmet. She needed to shut Im out long enough for her to get down to the ground. Check the whole chamber. She needed Im out of her suit, her display, her head. It was like Im lived there now. Deep in the recesses, in the folds and valleys of gray matter, a voice riding shotgun in her brain. Maybe it hadn't been stress back in the tunnel. Maybe when she'd felt that sick sensation that she was being watched, it was because she could hear Im's breathing, the faint sound of her shifting at her desk. Im, always there, but not there. Necessary, but ultimately useless. So useless. Worse than useless. Dangerous. Geyer, what are you doing? Im asked. Her fear was just a small note over careful, flat effect, but it was growing stronger. Her eyes had widened, her cheeks paled. Good. Let her be afraid. Not for Geyer, but for herself. Let her marinate in it. Even if it was only the fear of failure, of having to start over again, of having to live with the guilt added to the pile. If Geyer was going to die down here, let him feel it. Let it break her. Geyer closed the comm line, then reopened it to a different frequency. She couldn't lock the communications closed altogether, but she could leave Im behind and commit herself to a non-existent line, a ghost channel. Silent, expanded around her. Only broken by the heaving of her breast. The lower corner of her display was replaced by the cave. What now? She asked the emptiness, then laughed. Sitting down heavily. Lock my suit, drug me, but you're on your own, just like I am. Nothing answered her. She waited for retaliation, for the fuzzing of the world from anti-anxiety drugs, or maybe a sedative, for her suit to lock up, securing her to the rope, for him to find a way around the communications block, but nothing happened. Slowly, she cycled through the display options, illuminating the monitor. Excuse me. Illuminating the motionless cavern and the pool below in varied colors and textures until finally she switched back to her headlamp. There had been nothing, no signs of movement, but she had to be sure. She didn't want the smallest chance of interference. She opened her faceplate, getting rid of the HUD entirely. The air was cool, real. She could feel the cave on her flesh. All her training screamed for her to close the helmet again, to stop venting heat, to restore the integrity of the suit. That was the only thing keeping her safe and alive down here. She couldn't do it. For the first time in weeks, she could feel the real world curling against her cheek, filling her lungs. For the first time in a long time, she could trust everything she was perceiving. The water waited below her, the faint, ghostly glow beckoning. Meter deep. She could stand in a meter. She could see the bottom. Geyer began descending again, her fingers clumsy on the rappel rack. She went slowly, craning her head in every direction, pausing every few minutes to check for movement. Nothing shifted. Nothing changed as she slid down the line, as her feet broke the surface of the water, as she sunk in up to her hips, as she fumbled to unclip herself. Her heart raced. She couldn't stand still, couldn't think. She could almost feel the closing of fingers around her ankle, and she worked blindly, looking only at the water around her. She felt trapped, tethered, until she closed the rappel device back into her suit and began staggering for the nearby shore. The sound of sloshing water filled her ears, no longer filtered through her helmet. It was so loud, so sharp. It made her want to lie down and feel the water lapping against her skin. But there was somebody in here. She needed to stay alert. She needed to find them. Nothing moved but the shadows racing away from her lamp and the ripples of the water as she passed. No faces peered out at her from crevices in the rock as she hauled herself from the water. She paced away from the shore and slowly walked the perimeter of the lake, clambering over smooth outcroppings, skittering the edge. She checked every niche, every hollow. She waded into the shallow inlets, searching the bottom of the lake, until all that left were the darker, deeper regions. For those, she would have to dive. The water of the lake beckoned again. She fought the urge to plunge below. The glowing fungus in the water stopped her. Even if she could see unimpeded without the face mask, she could still be contaminated. Fuck. What had she done? She closed her helmet and took several deep, steadying breaths, then bent double, pushing her head below the surface above the darker, deeper reaches. Her light pierced through the water, marrying with a soft glow. She could see everything, and all she could find was rock, huge pillars, and worn-down boulders. She was alone. Gaia hauled herself back out onto the land. A low moan built in the low moan. I think it's supposed to say boat. No, it didn't. Excuse me. I guess I jumped a line in my reading and fucked myself up. Excuse me. Gaia hauled herself back out onto the land. A low moan built into the back of her throat. She crawled away from the bank. She tried to feel relief, to feel safe, but there was only numbness there, emptiness. What did it matter? Feeling safe. There had never been a threat to begin with. Em had been right. Isolation, stress, whatever lingering effects of those spores might have given her brain. She couldn't be left on her own, unmonitored. She was compromised. What had she been thinking? That Em would be disgusted with her, would hate her, would abandon her. That, given proof of Geyer's weakness, she'd leave. Now Geyer was alone anyway. Alone, foolish, and humiliated. Geyer pulled up the communication settings, face burning, and rankled, crawling back, apologetic to her broken brain. This wasn't a day's descent. This wasn't easy. This wasn't something she could do by herself, no matter how much she wanted to. She tried to close the silent comm line. It refused. That's the end of that chapter. Yeah. What do you guys think, man? I had a lot of fun reading this book. Like I said, I didn't know anything about the author. I had just seen this book on a couple different like horror lists and stuff of scary books. You know what I mean, like scariest books to read. Blah 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 blah. A couple different things like that. The book being "The Luminous Dead" by Caitlin Starling. And when I finished the book, I read the acknowledgments and all the stuff like that, and I thought that the about the author was kind of interesting. It says Caitlin Starling is a writer and spreadsheet wrangler who lives near Portland, Oregon, equipped with an anthropology degree and an unhealthy interest in the dark and macabre. She writes horror-tinged speculative fiction, of all flavors. The Luminous Dead is her first novel. I thought that was fucking awesome. I don't know that I have intentionally ever read someone's first novel, but it was really fun, man. It was really cool perspective. It was a cool mix of like the isolation, technology, and dread and stuff like that. A lot different from a lot of the horror books I typically read. I have a tendency to read a lot of like monster, like zombie, apocalypse fantasy. I'm really into the dystopian future type stuff. I read a lot of shit like that as well. Um, I don't know. As of late, I've been checking out two or three different lists of just like scariest novels ever written, you know, top 50 scary books to read in 2021. And then when I see books on two or three of those lists, I've just been checking them out. It's been really, really fun. Um, Not from a sexist commentary, but I don't know that I'd really necessarily read a lot of female authors, and apparently there are a shitload of female horror authors out there. A lot of the books that I encounter on those lists happen to be written by women, and I feel like I've, aside from the last book, the last two books were by men, but before that, I read like six books in a row that happened to be written by women, and I don't know that, like I said, that I had really read many books written by chicks, and let alone by authors I don't know, because I don't know about you guys, but I have a tendency to not really even try new authors. I feel like we all kind of fall into habits of doing and watching and reading things that we're familiar with, and you know, a book is a big commitment. It's hard to commit to a book you've never heard of, an author you've never heard of, and I don't know. Just through cross-referencing like random lists like that, I have found some really fucking cool books, you guys. I really highly recommend it. I have a blast catching a buzz, drinking a bunch of coffee, and fucking reading, man. It's really good for you. You know, it's the thing to do, guys.